listening to WHYY-FM in Philadelphia. And with me now is Philadelphia-based architect Robert Venturi, whose philosophy has influenced architects around the world. New York Times architecture critic Paul Goldberger called Venturi perhaps the nation's leading theorist of the so-called postmodern movement. He has surely done more than any other architect to shift architectural taste away from the sleekness of international-style modernism, unquote. Venturi's architectural views differed so radically from his peers and predecessors that Venturi was once referred to as the hooligan from Philadelphia. In his 1966 groundbreaking book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Venturi wrote that architecture could no longer afford to be intimidated by the puritanically moral language of orthodox modern architecture. Instead, he called for a style based on the richness and ambiguity of modern experience. Architects, he said, needed to move away from a high culture vocabulary and understand and use the language of our popular culture. This philosophy was developed in the book Learning from Las Vegas, which he co-authored in 1972. The authors of this book studied motels, hotels, supermarket parking lots, neon signs, and other commercial architecture to find an appropriate symbolic language of our time. Venturi's books are essentials of any architecture library, and his buildings are included in most surveys of postmodern architecture. Examples of buildings you can see in the Delaware Valley, designed by his firm Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown, include the Guild House on Spring Garden and 7th Streets, the Institute for Scientific Information on 35th and Market Streets, the 35-foot-high letters for the Basco store, which is on Roosevelt Boulevard, and the Best Store facade in Oxford Valley. He designed his mother's house in Chestnut Hill, which is now a very famous building, and he also designed the Franklin Court for the National Park Service and the Welcome Park in Society Hill. Robert Venturi also designs furniture, and a new line of his chairs and tables was recently added to the Knoll catalog. The shape of some of the chairs give them a cartoon-like quality, and they have been dubbed by some Gumby chairs. Robert Venturi is married to Denise Scott Brown, who is also a very well-known architect and a partner in the firm Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown. Robert Venturi, I want to welcome you to Fresh Air. It's really a great pleasure to have you here today. You said that you think architecture has had too much of a high art sensibility. Can you explain what that means?
Well, there are a lot of ways to approach that. We have referred quite a bit to the work of Herbert Gans, the urban sociologist, and one of his recent studies has concerned itself with what he's called the relativity of taste, where he has held that there is no one taste, there are several taste cultures, and he has made a beautiful analysis in this book of hierarchies of taste cultures, or if not hierarchies, kinds of taste cultures, and he analyzes middle taste, middle high taste, low high taste, and so forth, with beautiful effect. And we have found more and more that is appropriate for architects to realize. In the past, even in the recent days of modern architecture, it was assumed one aesthetic ideal, more or less, which was a kind of high upper class ideal that architects were then to impose upon other people, to teach them. This became one of the main problems, perhaps, with modern architectural impositions on subsidized housing for the poor, where the poor were made to live in buildings that looked different from what they wanted and what they considered was ideal. And we talk a lot about pluralism today, and this is a period when, in other fields, we do emphasize differences rather than the universality among people. And of course, other periods, there always was a distinction between aristocratic taste and folk taste, if you will. But it is now obvious that a simple distinction like that doesn't work anymore. The art historians always talk about, if you will, high art, aristocratic taste. And so it is important to understand and to be able to work into the richness and eclecticism of effect that we can have by combining taste. And this is obvious in most other fields where people can love the Beatles and Michael Jackson and also love Beethoven at the same time. And there is a place for each and so forth. And we like to think that in our architecture we can accommodate different attitudes toward taste, different markets, if you will, which is also another way that it has been put by developers and others.
But especially when you started expressing that notion, it was considered very radical, and it really shocked a lot of architects.
Well, I think it did, although on the other hand, again, there's quite a bit of precedent for that too. Modern architecture, when it was new in the early part of the century, went to what was then considered kind of base industrial vernacular architecture, factories, and it said, factories are beautiful, or industrial vernacular we can learn from. And it is really what happened was that pure modern architecture is essentially a factory kind of, we tend to forget this now because we sheathe it in marble and so forth, but it's essentially a factory aesthetic, a very Spartan kind of factory aesthetic that evolved as a vernacular, especially in the United States. And so there, high art went to low art for its inspiration, and this has been done a lot in the past. It's been said Beethoven's third movement in such and such a symphony is based on peasant tunes, or the Romantic poets went to daffodils. Wordsworth wrote about simple flowers. That was very shocking at the time. And so our going to the commercial vernacular rather than to the industrial vernacular was shocking. We think it's valid. We, in fact, are not being so literal as the early modernists were about adapting the industrial vocabulary. They were quite literal. Their buildings really looked like factories. We are saying learning from Las Vegas. We're not saying adapting Las Vegas or using it everywhere. And that kind of fits in with what we were just talking about, that there's an opportunity for many kinds of architecture. But we went to the commercial vernacular for inspiration, just as the pop artists went to pop art, commercial architecture, and as I say, other artists in the past have done it. It often happens. Works the other way too, where pop art learns from high art, and that kind of interaction has always been very strong and very exciting and valid.
You said that Beethoven incorporated peasant tunes into his work, but do you think it's fair to compare neon signs or Las Vegas hotels with peasant dances, because it's not a folk culture in that respect. It's made by pretty sophisticated, money-hungry kind of people that want to turn a profit from the architecture. It's not, it's not a folk art in that respect.
I think you can make an analogy like that, because I think these are just, I think there hardly exists a folk art in that. I don't think folk necessarily means craft. It did in the past, but it doesn't necessarily today. I think probably to the maybe to the aristocrat of the 18th century, folk art was just as shockingly distasteful as the neon is to us, to many of us. And we look back with sort of nostalgic eyes and say, the folk art is beautiful. Probably it did not appear beautiful. It's very hard I can't gauge that. I'm not a historian, but I think the analogies can be made. I think basing folk art on the fact that individuals did it with their hands is incidental and almost impossible today in one sense. I think it's arguable. It's an interesting point.
Can you remember the time when you first started thinking that commercial architecture like neon signs and hotel facades were really worth looking at carefully and learning from?
Yes, I can remember when I was didn't look at them at all, and there were, I think, several in several ways I came to it. One was Denise Scott Brown, who had gone to Los Angeles, became sensitive to the qualities of this before I did. I learned a lot from Tom Wolfe. I learned very much from Tom Wolfe and his essay on Las Vegas. I learned a lot from the pop artists. But I think fundamentally I learned in this way. I think that I was a young American architect who went to Europe rather early and spent several years studying in Rome. And in a sense, I became somewhat like an expatriate that you read about. And I think what happened to me was what happened often to American expatriates when they go to Europe. I think this happened to the writers maybe in Paris in the 20s. You look back on your country and you become almost more American. You see your country from another perspective, and you're thrilled by the European experience, and you're learning a lot and taking in all of this high culture and absorbing it and learning from it and benefiting from it. But you're also, it's putting into highlight, into contrast, what you've come from. And I have a feeling that Denise, as someone who had been not born an American, as someone who I who is rather steeped in European architectural culture as a relatively young person, it's something we could more easily see. We could more easily come back and see this as not only detestable, not only ordinary, and be fascinated by it. I think because we knew Italian piazzas so well, we could then come back and see American streets, American strips. And I could write, as in the Complexity and Contradiction book, Main Street is almost all right. That was shocking in the 50s, in the 60s. And also, I think that was another reason that we had maybe more than many other architects of our generation who didn't usually rely on European tradition and background. We could see the American scene better.
The Las Vegas style of architecture, I think, opposes everything that architects are supposed to learn in school. I mean, it's garish, it's loud, it calls attention to itself. It names what it is. It has a sign saying what it is on it. What have you borrowed from that in your own approach to architecture that you think is desirable?
Well, in a way, it's through Las Vegas we came to symbolism in architecture, and you can kind of define architecture in terms of its aesthetics as a combination of form and symbol. You can look at a building and say, oh, it has beautiful form, but inevitably it can't be like abstract expressionist art. It has to remind you of things as well, and that's the symbolic content, and it always more or less has more form or more symbol. In the early part of this century, the eclectic architects who loved to evoke historical styles, the Gothic buildings of a college, for instance, relied maybe more heavily on symbolism than form. The main benefit was, this is Gothic, and it reminds you of medieval scholars and tradition and all those other things that they wanted. You could look at a modern building and often more or less forget it was a factory and look at it and say, what beautiful white volumes coming together in shadow. Now, always you balance this out, but usually there's an imbalance one way or the other. And when I was young and in the late days of modern architecture, essentially symbolism had been thrown out, decoration had been thrown out, ornament had been thrown out. And by going to Europe partly and looking at historical buildings and admiring the forms, we could not also help but admire the ornament, the sculptural qualities, the highly symbolic content. And so we learned there. But when we went to Las Vegas, we saw an architecture in the environment which was almost all symbol and hardly form at all. And that's why Las Vegas and the Strip, and the American Strip, we use Las Vegas as an exaggerated example of the typical Strip, why it's so distasteful, or it was, to the traditional architect, because there were hardly any forms that made up space, that gave you a sense of space. And that was because the forms were relatively small and far apart, so you could have all that parking around them. And therefore you had to substitute the signs. So if you looked at it as an environment of signs rather than an environment of forms, it was no longer so amorphous and so kind of unidentified, if you will. I forget now what the question was. But anyhow, yes, you're talking about signs. And so essentially that took us back to Rome again. So we went from Rome to Las Vegas, back to Rome. We said, we should look at Rome, or let's say, use that as a synonym for historical European architecture. Let's look at the iconography again. And of course, if you look at a Gothic cathedral, it's not only beautiful form, there's an enormous ingredient of iconography that art historians had never forgotten about, but architects had. And essentially, the facade of a Gothic cathedral is a billboard. It has all those niches in it, and each niche has a statue, and some statues are farther toward the edge, some are nearer the middle, some are bigger, and they have other qualities. And if you are a medieval man or an iconographer, you can read that quality about it. So in a sense, the modern architect talked about expression, which is the aesthetic effect of form. We began to talk about meaning, which is the aesthetic effect of symbol. And again, you always combine it, but that's how we got back to symbol and signs, and I think other people have paralleled us and done it too, and their road was a different road from ours very often.
You've literally used signs in some of your architecture, and I'm thinking, for instance, of the Guild House, which is in Philadelphia on 7th and Spring Garden Streets, and it says Guild House on it in pretty large letters that you can't miss, and it's very handsomely lettered. I mean, I find the lettering very attractive, but why do you have the name of the house so prominently displayed on it?
Well, I think it's partly that it's on a street which is not a strip, but it is Spring Garden Street, where cars go generally rather fast. And so, like a strip, you need big scale in order to have it taken in. You cannot have great subtlety and refinement on a strip or on a highway. In the old days, when streets were small and you either went at the most 10 or 20 miles an hour in a carriage or you walked, you could savor small details and you had time to look at them. And of course, with the automobile, you can take Main Street, where you began to go faster, the signs became more important. Go to the strip, the signs became all important. And this was an opportunity to say, this had to read. That sign was something that was, we had to kind of sell to the client. It looked very big and bold at that time, as did that stripe. There's a stripe at the top, and it's interesting, today I see young architects sort of covering their buildings with stripes, and I say, they must look at Guild House and say, oh, how timid that is. And they don't realize that 20 years ago, that took enormous guts, and it wasn't so much guts in terms of what other people would think, but just in terms of what I would think, in a sense, to use an applied white stripe. We're getting to ornament now rather than to signs, but the building is interesting because I think it now looks a little timid in the light of what's being done today. I think eventually people will realize again that it was quite original for its time in using a sign and also some applied pattern on it.
New Jersey, especially the Admiral Wilson Boulevard, is filled with architecture that I think for this region is pretty similar to what you were looking at 15 or 20 years ago in Las Vegas. What do you think of the Admiral Wilson Boulevard and all the signs and visual displays there?
I guess I don't know how far it extends, but I think it's sad that in the East we do associate strips with Admiral Wilson Boulevards and sort of adult peep show places and also sort of areas of the city that are not well maintained. So there's always kind of a sordid association, either in terms of maintenance or the uses. And it is interesting that one does have to go to the West really to see the pure example where there are not those associations.
Do you think that commercial architecture has become more corporate and less pop?
Yes, very much so. It's becoming more tasteful. And that's partly the result of design review boards, which we're very much against. That's another whole story. But yes, it has. I think this thing of good taste is sort of filtering down and having bad effects. And I think very often our attitude is that the signs aren't big enough. And very often an environment will look better if the signs are bigger. And I wouldn't want big signs on my street where I live. There are these hierarchies and other things to be considered. It is true also that if you look at many old photographs of American streets, New York, Philadelphia, small towns, those streets in those days were littered with big signs, so that big signs are part of the American culture. And in the photographs, even I think to people who don't like signs today, they are very beautiful. Very often they're very beautiful. They're beautiful graphics, and they're a beautiful kind of, have a beautiful richness of effect. But I think making signs small or prissy does not add to the thing. And the real quality of the strip really is you don't go there for a kind of serene, kind of upper taste aesthetic effect. You go there for vitality. And that is, of course, one of the qualities you have to have. And as soon as you pretty up those things, then you really kind of want to join the people who are totally against signs, automatically against them.
Can you think of a company or a style of commercial architecture that's becoming more, quote, tasteful?
Well, I think of the Holiday Inns or the Holiday Inn sign that's rather well known. was not one of the great commercial art signs, I think. I think you can find other ones. But they are changing and becoming more sort of high class and more good taste. I think McDonald's is evolving in this way with sort of mansard roofs and things like that. So I think it's happening a lot. And it isn't, the results are not always less effective, but I think generally they are.
How can you show your respect for certain aspects of commercial, consumer-oriented architecture without thoroughly embracing the consumer culture that comes with it, the emphasis on buying and shopping and getting?
Well, we have been asked that, and Europeans, of course, especially more than Americans, ask that question because they're sort of in their radical tradition, architects and so forth, are more sensitive to the problems of mass, what's the word, mass?
Consumption.
Consumption, and I think we say, essentially our approach to that is we have used Las Vegas and the Strip and other strips as something to learn from, just as we learn from the architecture of Versailles or we learn from the architecture of Chartres. It doesn't mean that we are we espouse medieval Catholicism or that we espouse absolutism. We learn it as a technique, and I think as individuals, as opposed as to technicians, naturally we find the materialism that it represents a lot. On the other hand, I don't take that too seriously because I think that kind of, myself, I think that kind of exploitation is not really the worst of the exploitations of all today. To kind of force people to buy more appliances than they want does not worry me at all as much as the military-industrial complex things that we're involved in. So I can't get too worked up over that myself, and I do feel that much of the best art today and the most vital art is advertising art and graphics and television, even though I don't agree with so much with the substance of it or the content of it. The techniques are great, but I think essentially it's not one of our biggest problems, in my opinion.
Architect Robert Venturi is my guest. You think television commercials are good art?
I think they're often fantastic art. They're like sonnets. They are, or odes. They are compressing a lot, or a quartet in music. They're compressing a lot into a small amount, and they're obviously very expensive, and those guys get much more pay than real artists do, fine artists do. I think they're very effective, very often.
Can you think of one recent one that you really like a lot?
Oh, I think the Pepsi-Cola ones are pretty good.
The Michael Jackson ones, or?
Those and others in general. I must say I look at them so objectively I don't remember too much the message.
When you were in Las Vegas, did you make any suggestions to them about how to change or amplify the architecture and the environment there?
Yes, out of our study where we took Yale students we spent a term, and Yale students made a big research project out of this. This was about 10 or 12 years ago, and out of it became a book. And we would have liked it if they had come to us. Actually, they were not interested. They didn't understand what we were doing. We did make some specific suggestions, like don't pretty it up. Don't plant trees along the Strip. For one thing, it's bad ecologically and increases the moisture content and so forth of the environment, and things of that sort. But they just didn't get it. There was one headline while we were there which said something. We were trying to get a little money from the Hughes Corporation and other interests of that sort to help pay for this trip, and from local sources we actually got very little from that. But one of the local newspapers while we were there had a headline saying Yale professor asks $5,000 for a study of Strip, and then 2 days later it said something like this: Yale professor ups price to $4,000 or $6,000, whatever. So it was all kind of not very much understood. It takes time. There's such a thing as being right too soon on some of these things. So it was not understood.
You're designing furniture now, and the Knoll catalog has recently added some of your chairs, a sofa, and a couple of tables to their catalog. Does the philosophy that you have in architecture apply as well to the furniture you design?
Yes, I think it does in a general way, and that's an interesting question because we learned very soon that designing chairs in many ways is very different from designing buildings. You're dealing literally with 30 seconds of inches in terms of comfort and in terms of aesthetics. You can something can be a 32nd of an inch different, and it can mean the difference between good and bad. Obviously, buildings, you work in increments that are much bigger. There's also the question of the physical comfort that you have to connect with. You really have to deal with the human body much more directly, because you're dealing with contact of the body, which you seldom do in architecture in any way. It's, the comfort factor is at another level and less physical and direct. So things like that are very different. On the other hand, the kind of main aesthetic ideas apply, and I think our philosophy of architecture, if you can have a philosophy of architecture, that sounds rather pretentious, but our particular approach to architecture was applicable to the furniture.
I think it's the people at Knoll who've started calling your chairs Gumby chairs because the molded plywood is kind of bent and a little wavery, and it looks a little like Gumby's limbs and kind of cartoon-like. What do you think of that appellation?
Fun. It's okay. It did apply to one particular chair. If I may back up a minute, and I'll still be answering the question. I think the approach was to the furniture that actually we have 8 chairs or 9 different chairs, and in a way we felt that at any one point we would not design an ideal chair, one ideal. I think when some of the other artists in the past, like Mies van der Rohe or at Knoll or Marcel Breuer, at any one moment they designed the chair, which would be the universal, beautiful chair. We like the idea that at any one moment we would design a chair that had several several kinds of characteristics. And again, that fits in with our idea of not a universal ideal, of not going for unity and clarity, but for going for richness of effect and some ambiguity of effect. And so we have these chairs that are in different historical styles, although they're very generalized. Queen Anne, Chippendale, Empire, and Art Deco, Art Nouveau. The Gumby, I meant. No, I knew that was wrong. The Gumby chair, they refer to as connects with the Art Nouveau chair, which has somewhat that quality, incidentally. I don't mind it a bit. I think it's wonderful when people, assuming they're not only making fun of what you're doing, are finding dimensions in what you do that are beyond what you thought of. I think that's a great compliment.
What's your favorite chair in your home and in your office to sit in?
I hardly sit, because when I go home I'm so tired I go right to bed and look at TV and do the crossword puzzle. But we have lots of chairs in our house, because I think someone counted 83, because we like chairs. We don't collect them, but we like them. And I guess my favorite easy chair is a chair that had been in the lobby of the Traymore Hotel in Atlantic City. And when that hotel was coming down, Denise and I went to Atlantic City and bought a whole truckload of furniture from it. The chair cost $4. Our dining room chairs cost 35 cents. And they're really museum pieces, and they're recognized now as very beautiful chairs. But we have, our tastes are eclectic, and we have 18th century chairs and Art Nouveau chairs that match the house that we have. So it's hard to say a favorite. It's like saying, what's your favorite child of your children? It's hard to say. I like a lot of them.
You mix a lot of periods and centuries and styles in your home, and a lot of people would just be appalled at that and thinking that like a Queen Anne chair needs to be in an environment of the same period and the same style.
Well, I think fewer people are now thinking that. I think they're coming around to an eclecticism of approach. But yes, it does fit in with our attitude of mixing styles and kind of making juxtapositions that are I think not jarring, but exciting and attractive and rich in effect.
Do you have a lot of chrome and leather type furniture in your office?
No, we don't have that. We have hardly any modern furniture. We only have one kind of modern chair, a Joe Colombo chair, an Italian plastic chair of the 60s. Otherwise, we don't have much modern. We have early modern. We have chairs of the turn of the century from Barcelona and France. But otherwise, it's more historic, earlier stuff.
Architect Robert Venturi is my guest. And what was it? An apartment or a private home or what? What was the inside like?
Okay, I'm a Philadelphia boy, and I grew up in a house in Upper Darby, in Powell Lane, Upper Darby, a semi-detached house. And then when I was in college, my family moved to Rosemont, where it was a bigger house, and the furniture was very beautiful furniture, and virtually all of it I now have in our house. And it was furniture chosen mostly by my mother, who was interested in design and in furniture and had good taste, although I shouldn't refer to good taste after what I just said about the relativity of taste. And I shared her interest in furniture going way back. When I was a little kid, I knew the difference between Queen Anne and Chippendale and all that. I had a natural interest in it.
What was your bedroom designed like? What kind of furniture did you have inside?
It was what they gave me, and it was I guess you'd now call it kind of 18th century-like furniture as well as 18th century furniture.
Did you ever get into fights with your mother about wanting to do something in the room that she didn't want in there?
No, there was none of that. Of course, my generation was not so revolutionary concerning parents, at least at that level. We sort of held it in more, I guess. We still had the same attitude towards parents, I guess, at that age. But no, there was not much of that. There was some of that in how you would dress, but I really wasn't that interested in my immediate environment, and I never have been. And the fact that Denise and I now have a house where we have taken that interest in is relatively recent. I hadn't thought of that, but that's because we now have a family and a child, and we sort of, it makes sense to make a home. But before that, I really was like the shoemaker, or I was like the dressmaker who never looks good. She's always making beautiful dresses, or you can make images of that sort. I was never interested in my own environment. I never particularly bought things for myself. Where I lived was sort of the result of convenience and circumstance.
Were you neat or sloppy in your home?
That's pretty neat, I think. It's pretty neat, but I didn't think of my house or my room as particularly an expression of my philosophy.
When you were an architect and you were still not paying that much attention to your own home, did you ever worry that like a client would come over and they'd accuse you of being a fraud because look at the way your home was designed?
I didn't worry about that too much. Actually, that would apply to our office now in Manayunk, where we're in an old mill, and very often architects go to old loft buildings because they need lots of space, and at the same time architects don't make huge profits, so that it makes sense to do that. And we have a space like that, and it is a kind of workspace, and I think it has lots of quality and lots of character. It has big windows and lots of air and light, and generosity of effect and space, but it is not fancy in any way, and it's more or less everything that's there is there for a purpose and not for effect. And we assume that the clients we get will understand that. We don't make a kind of corporate effect, or an effect that a corporate client would like, and the few corporate clients we have understand that. But it is an interesting question of how you project your image, and we project our image as sort of eager workmen, eager workers, and there is a lot of the clutter of work, and we hope that will have a positive effect rather than a negative one.
You're, as an adult and as an architect now, very interested in the language of popular culture. When you were growing up, were you too? I mean, did you read a lot of comic books, go to the movies all the time, listen to records?
I was a real square. I was what you'd now call a nerd. I saw that movie the other night, and it just changed my whole attitude of how I look at things. And I was a nerd and a square, and I really didn't like comic books. I knew few of the little about the popular music of the time. Was not interested in baseball and football, and I didn't keep up with that. So I was not a child who connected with the popular culture. it wasn't that I didn't want to be, I just wasn't interested. It wasn't that I was trying to be highfalutin or anything. I would rather have liked to have been like everybody else in that way. So it is interesting that we are tarred with this kind of, sometimes it's tarring with this reputation of being very pop in our approach. I myself am not that way naturally, or didn't in my youth connect with that kind of thing much.
So was it an intellectual interest in the vernacular?
No, it wasn't intellectual either, because we really were. It was intellectual and emotional. I mean, we went to Las Vegas, and it was love-hate, and we said, I think, God, looking at this in one way, this is fantastic. This effect. And you go to Los Angeles or the Western city again, you cannot see it in the East, because the East is always half-hearted. There's always a wonderful old 18th century barn that's been ruined by what's gone around it, and you see that juxtaposition, and you don't like it. But there you're in kind of virgin territory for that kind of thing. No, we aesthetically, I say we all the time, because Denise and I work closely, but also architects should always say we, because they depend on other people so much, fellow artists, younger usually than themselves. But our effect was one of fascination and attraction as well as repulsion at the same time. But we were saying, there it is, and it works, and we must understand why. And it can't be utter chaos, because chaos would not work. I mean, there is validity to this because it exists. But we also saw the aesthetic effect of it, and I still do. And even though my child is a great fan of the current music, I don't know anything about it. I don't know the names of the people, but in general, I like it. I'm just not interested in getting into it. So I do understand it.
When was it that you knew you wanted to study architecture?
I can't remember when I didn't want to, and I was probably influenced by both my parents, because my father wanted to be an architect. His father before him had been a builder, and my mother was very interested in architecture. So obviously I was influenced, but there was never any obvious pressure. And I always wanted to be an architect. I remember the route that I took to school when I was very young. I had favorite houses along the road that I would be interested in looking at. And so I was always fascinated by buildings. But I was somewhat encouraged. I remember a story that I like very much. When I must have been 10 or 12 years old, I was in New York with my father, and we were going down 7th Avenue in a taxi. And as the taxi went past, or was about to pass the old wonderful Penn Station, you probably don't remember that. It was this great railroad station by McKim, Mead & White called Penn Station on 7th Avenue. My father had an inspiration, and he said, we told the taxi driver to stop and to wait, and we'd be back in 3 minutes. And he took me through the great gallery that went from the street to the huge room of Penn Station. It was one of the most impressive rooms in America, based on the Basil Caracalla. And he said, I'd just like you to see this. And I looked and loved it, and we walked back, got in the cab, and went to where we were going. So he was sharing things with me, and it was a very beautiful relationship in that way, to share something with a parent that you both like. And it was really terrific.
My guest is architect Robert Venturi. What was the reigning philosophy of architecture when you were in school, and the principles that you were taught with the way things were?
By school, you mean college?
Architecture school.
Architecture school, yeah. Well, I think I was very lucky in that I went to a school that was somewhat different from other schools. I went to Princeton University School of Architecture, and I studied architecture as an undergraduate, because I majored in architecture because I knew I wanted to be an architect. And then I went there in graduate school. And at the time, Princeton was teaching modern architecture. Most schools were by then in the mid and late 40s. Not all, but most were. And so modern architecture was well accepted, and we designed modern buildings. At the same time, history of architecture was still considered very important in the curriculum, and they had a very strong department. And there was one teacher in particular, Donald Drew Egbert, who was a very great historian, who influenced me a lot. And and so I had a very strong basis in the history of architecture, and so we saw modern architecture always in the context of the history. Now, this is an oversimplification, but I could have gone, let's say, to Harvard, which was considered then the best school. It was run under the Bauhaus principles of Walter Gropius, who had just come from Germany. You got the word directly from Germany of the 30s. It came into the 40s, the word directly. But I would not have got history there, or I'd have got a history that was very, very kind of based on what was appropriate to connect with modern architecture. And I think the reason was that modern architecture there was taught as an ideology. It was almost a religion. It was really not an education. It was a kind of indoctrination. Now, that's being unfair to some extent, but and we at Princeton were taught that this is the architecture of now. It came out of something else, and the implication was that it was going to evolve into something else. And I think I and many of the others who went to this small school at Princeton at that time were much more easy, where it was much easier for us to evolve and to grow. And I think probably Princeton has a greater percentage of leaders in the field now as a result of this. And in a sense, postmodernism to some extent came out of this idea of looking at architecture as much more complex than an ideology and a set of rules that this is the way to do it.
What made you realize that for you, the kind of modernism that was being practiced wasn't going to work? That you couldn't practice in that way?
Well, I think as an artist, it was purely intuitive. It's what I liked. And in the end, at that time, I was beginning to find that I really didn't like modern architecture. It bored me. Louis Kahn was very influential to me then, who was essentially a modern architect, if you will. But he was someone who had wonderful dimensions and who questioned a lot and who didn't do just what was expected. And that was an influence. And then there was, of course, my background at Princeton and my love of history, and that was fed. And so I had a much greater knowledge. But essentially, what it was I didn't like it. It was not exciting me. It was boring. I didn't learn from it. And I learned not from the current architecture of the time in the 50s and the 60s, but I learned from history, going back and learning lessons from history. So I think, and essentially that's what happened with us with Las Vegas. Denise and I went and we said, hey, we kind of like this. Let's find out why. And then we intellectualized and analyzed it. And I think that isn't the only way, but that's probably the artist's way.
What was the first building that you designed that earned you the reputation of a renegade?
It's hard to know because I was thinking the other day that my mother's house, which really has been extremely influential, that it was published only in one magazine. It wasn't a little one, Progressive Architecture, but it was not a very big article. And it's hard. There was no one thing. Like Michael Graves, the architect who's very well known now, has made a big splash with one building in Portland, Oregon. That never happened with us. I think I cannot answer that as sort of a quick thing. It's been very, very slow.
You want to describe the house that you built in Chestnut Hill that your mother lives in?
Yes. It's a house that has now looks again not so extraordinary as it did then, and it's a house that is in one way is modern and in another way has historical allusions, and it's a house that has a number of things that to a lay audience, I think on the radio would not mean so much, but it had windows in it that looked like windows. Modern architecture had got rid of windows that were holes in the wall and said those are bad, and instead they had absences of wall. That's why you had these great big spans. So these had not only holes in the wall, but they also had panes making X's and grids. That's quite common now. That was very daring then. It had applied ornament. It had applied moldings on it. It had an arch, had two arches over it that were not structural. Unheard of to do an arch in the first place, because arch is old-fashioned and not modern. And then to do it not structurally would be very bad. It had complexity. It had layers. It sort of had an outside wall and then an inside wall behind it. And the outside did not automatically reflect the inside. A tenet of modern architecture was you design from the inside out, and the house and the beauty and the architectural effect of it comes automatically from having it work well, from having it be functional. Well, this house looked one way on the outside and looked and worked differently on the inside, and has been done for many centuries, and it's not immoral. But that was at the time very daring. It had a sloping roof. I remember Paul Rudolph saying, "How can you do a house that doesn't have a flat roof?" And before, people had been doing sloping roofs, but they were always sheds. They never went two ways to make
an A.
Yeah, an A or a this is one of the most common words in architecture, and it's blocked out of me. A pediment, if you will, a gable end, and again, that's very, very obvious now, but that was rather shocking then. So I think a lot of things of that sort were made it that way. And it also sort of looked like a house. It looked like a child's concept of a house. It looked a little like the drawing of a house. Again, in those days, to be a great architect, you had to be original, and everyone knew that all the great artists like Manet and Gauguin and so forth did what was considered outrageous. They shocked the bourgeoisie. That meant it was good, and it probably was for that reason to some extent. I was doing something that didn't, and in a certain way, didn't look shocking. It was familiar. Actually, it was shocking because it was familiar. So all of those things come into it. It's very interesting.
What were the worst criticisms you got for that house?
You know, when the criticisms are made, I get furious and hurt both at the same time, and then I tend to forget them. And I don't even remember them. I mean, I forget. There are a lot of them.
A lot of nasty things.
I guess you tend to make yourself forget them in order to go on.
Why do you think it caught on as well as it did? Because
I think it was right. I think it was right, but it caught on much later, and I mean, you know, for many years it was not particularly appreciated.
How come you don't live in a house that you built?
Because we can't afford it. What we have to do, and I think many architects do, is you buy an older house which is relatively cheaper per square foot and sort of fix it up. I think that's the reason.
You at one time lived in the Society Hill Towers in Philadelphia,
yes.
which is a high-rise in the Society Hill area of the center city, and it seems very contradictory to the kind of populist philosophy that you have. Were you comfortable in it?
We didn't agree with it entirely architecturally, but it was not a bad place to live, and we had a fantastic view of the skyline, and we thought of it as temporary and convenient. And again, I have not been interested in making where I live an expression of what I do. And I think the reason is because if you're a worker and an artist, you're so busy doing your thing that you cannot also do the other. Very often, there are, of course, many artists like Frank Lloyd Wright or Thomas Jefferson who made their own house an expression of what they want. And that is certainly a tack you could take. I never took it until recently a little with the house we have bought.
You have a lot of patterning in your home now on the walls. Does the patterning ever distract you? I know a lot of people like to have off-white walls because it's restful and it doesn't distract you from the reading that you're doing or whatever you're thinking. And a lot of people are afraid that if the walls were loud, that it would just give them a headache all the time.
Well, that's a really good point. And the reason it is because I think you can say that there are some kinds of rooms or spaces where you can have the ornament be very, very imposing. And then there are other rooms, like maybe your bedroom or your den or something, or your living room, where you don't want it to, you want it to be recessive. Essentially, we have made ours recessive, and I constantly look at it and I say, oh, is it too, the question is it too recessive or is it too the other way? And you have to strike a balance. But I think there is opportunity and it involves a sense of appropriateness. Ours is recessive, and I think it softens the background. In a sense, it is softer, possibly, than white walls are, which in their way can be rather aggressive and they can be rather glary.
Speaking with architect Robert Venturi, what are some of the trends now you see in contemporary architecture, ones that you like and ones that you find very unappealing?
Well, I wrote a little article a while back where the subtitle was Plus ça change, plus la même chose. The more things change, the more they're the same. And I think I found that in general, the things I was critical of in the old days, way back when I wrote the Complexity and Contradiction book, I still find I'm pretty critical of still, and that even though in some ways a lot of architects have come around to what I've said, it is a kind of superficial complexity and contradiction. And I think an awful lot of architecture today is strident and superficial and does not have a kind of basic serenity that generally architecture must have, generally, not always, because it is a background for living and it is not a show-off thing. It should not be a place essentially where the architect shows off in an obvious way. What we like to refer to the architecture we do as second glance architecture. You see it sort of, oh, hey, this is pretty good, or after you've been living in it 5 years, you're not tired of it, that kind of thing. Once in a while, there's an opportunity. Maybe the city hall of a city should be a show-off example of civic pride or something, but in general, most architecture should be recessive and set off City Hall and set off you if you're living in the house. And
that doesn't seem to me to go hand in hand with the Las Vegas.
Well, again, we said learning from Las
yells
Vegas.
At you there.
We said learning from Las Vegas. And again, we were learning about symbolism, and we were learning about the automobile city. And we were saying the imposition of the kind of Italian piazza that was being brought in at the time into modern American cities was not working very well. And that the automobile city must be accepted. It's here for a while at least, and we were trying to say, let's see how we can make it beautiful rather than to ignore the automobile, say it's hateful and get rid of it or forget it, sweep it under the rug. So again, the garishness was almost incidental, and it was not. And naturally, even in Las Vegas, if you're living in a residential neighborhood, it's not garish. I mean, it's a question of appropriateness, which I think they understand there.
Your work has always been very controversial. Do you feel ultimately that you're conservative or avant-garde? Where do you think of yourself?
We think of ourselves as just workers who are trying to do the appropriate thing and keep ourselves interested in what we're doing and vital. And we don't sit down and say, oh, let's be avant-garde. And as a matter of fact, it's very inconvenient to be avant-garde, especially if you're an architect, because for architects, most clients are conservative, or they are committees more and more. They're no longer individuals. Committees are naturally conservative. So the image of being avant-garde is not good, and it's one we don't cultivate. We don't think of ourselves as avant-garde. We think of ourselves as sensible, reasonable, common sense, and very hard workers.
I want to talk for a couple of minutes about some of the buildings that you've done here in Philadelphia. One of the recent ones is the Institute for Scientific Information on 35th and Market Streets, and that has colored tiles in the front. And is that a reference to computer graphics in any way?
I didn't intend it to be at all, but I like it when people say that, and I guess it could be. I did not think of it as that way at all. I just thought of other things when we were doing it. But there we had a relatively low budget, which was a challenge. We did not resent that at all, and we said this building has to be ordinary in the good sense, in terms of its spatial makeup. It could not have kind of sculptural zigzags and ins and outs, and we would get the architectural effect from the decoration of the ordinary and simple facade, and it's essentially a facade that talks about rhythm and quality, things of that sort.
And I know a lot of our listeners know the 35 feet high letters that you designed for the Basco building on Roosevelt Boulevard. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, that is one of the few jobs that we designed, and Steve Eisenhower had a lot to do with it in our office, that does connect with Las Vegas. Our work seldom, it does connect in a direct way. I think everything we do concerns in a way. And that essentially was where Basco came to us and said we had this very, very big old building along the Roosevelt Boulevard, and we want to do something within a reasonable budget to give it an effect from the street. And we said the building is hopeless. Let's do something to disguise the building or distract the eye. It's a little like someone who can't take a bath and they use perfume. So we kind of did something up front which distracted the eye by making these big letters. It's now been taken over by Best Products, who's another client of ours who have come to us to modify the sign.
Do you think working within modest budgets has influenced the development of your sensibility?
Yes, it has. I don't particularly resent working within modest budgets because I think that kind of discipline can be good for you. But it does affect us because now that we get bigger budgets, I think it does we're so used to be intimidated by the realities of budget that it might inhibit us a little. But in a way that has been a problem, but it's also been, I think, a benefit and made us more a kind of disciplined than we would have been otherwise, and maybe been a benefit in the end.
Your work was so controversial, you were once called the hooligan from Philadelphia. Now that you're an internationally renowned architect, do you feel that any young architecture students think of you as being part of the establishment?
Oh, yes, I think some of them, a lot of them do. I think some of them do, and it's very ironic. We think it's very ironic. We say we've gone from radical, controversial to old fogey establishment without once experiencing establishment, without once experiencing, real establishment. That isn't true, but I'm sure that is the case to some extent. And it is interesting because I think a lot of people who are kind of doing things that we advocated way back don't even know that what they're doing connects with what we did. It was so long ago. And in a way that's nice, and in a way it hurts a bit because you naturally like to have the credit.
You care a lot about history and about history books. Are you concerned with how history will describe your work, 50 years from now?
Well, naturally, I think everybody would like to have his or her work remembered, no question about that. But I don't think you think about it much. I think all you do, if you're a good artist, is just try to do the best you can with any particular thing, and that's enough. If you say, I'm going to do really great and immortal art today, you will succeed much less than if you just say, I'm going to try to deal with this damn problem and do well with it now.
I've really enjoyed the chance to speak with you. Thanks so much for talking with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I've been speaking with Bob Venturi, who's an architect based in Philadelphia. He is with the firm Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown. He's internationally known. Two of his books are Standards of Any Architecture Library, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, and Learning from Las Vegas, which he co-authored with Steve Eisenhower and Denise Scott Brown. And several buildings are in the Delaware Valley that his firm has designed. And again, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's 3 minutes to 5, and we'll be joining National Public Radio at 5 for tonight's edition of All Things Considered, and I'll tell you what's happening tomorrow afternoon on Fresh Air after this report from Shadow Traffic.